He was an industry titan, a man who bought and sold empires between appetizers, his net worth far exceeding GDP of small nations. She was the woman who served him water, a ghost in an immaculate apron, invisibly insignificant, or so he thought. In the quiet, velvet-draped elegance of New York City's most exclusive restaurant, he decided to test his foreign business partners with a barrage of Russian, a language he was sure nobody else at the table, much less in the room, would understand. He made a cruel, dismissive joke at his waitress's expense. What he never expected was her to reply fluently, turning his power play into a public humiliation that would change their lives forever. The ambiance was charged with the aroma of money and roasted duck. It was a fragrance Clara had come to know intimately during the last 3 years, a heavy, cloying perfume that clung to the velvet curtains and settled deep within the grain of the mahogany tables. It reeked of deals closed with 100-year-old cognac, of a world so far removed from hers that serving it felt like looking through the wrong end of a telescope. Clara moved with an economy of movement that bordered on invisibility. A glass of water refilled here, a crumb removed with a silver napkin there. Her uniform, an austere black dress with a starched white apron, was a cloak of anonymity. To Everleigh's customers, she was not Clara Vance. The woman who once debated the etymological roots of Proto-Indo-European verbs with distinguished professors at Yale was not the daughter who had held her father's hand as his construction empire crumbled under the weight of medical bills. She was simply the girl, a pair of hands, a fleeting presence. That night, the Solstice Chamber, Everleigh's most private and opulent dining room, was occupied. The reservation was under a single name that had sent a wave of anxiety through the staff, Sterling Blackwood. Blackwood, rich, was a force of nature, a predator in a tailored suit. His photograph appeared regularly in financial magazines, always with the same cold, calculating stare. He was a self-made monster in the world of technology and logistics, having climbed from nothing with a legendary ruthlessness. He was known for his brutal negotiations and his absolute disdain for anyone he considered inferior, a category that, in his opinion, included almost everyone. Clara felt the familiar knot in her stomach while preparing the room. She polished the baccarat crystal glasses until they were transparent splinters of light. She aligned the heavy silver cutlery with an obsessive precision. Every detail had to be perfect. With a client like Sterling Blackwood, a single fork tine out of place could feel like a personal insult, and his displeasure was not something one wanted to face. He arrived exactly at 8, flanked by 3 men. Blackwood was taller than his photo suggested, with an angular, severe face and hair the color of polished steel. He moved with a contained energy, a barely repressed impatience, as if the simple act of walking were a waste of his valuable time. He didn't recognize Clara Vance. His gaze swept over her and the room as if she were just another accessory, a lamp, or a chair. The other men were a study in deference. 2 of them, sleek and nervous, were clearly his subordinates, their eyes constantly seeking their boss's approval. The third man was different. He was older, with a broad Slavic face and an expensive heavy coat. He moved with a silent authority that suggested he was not an employee. This must be the partner, the reason for this high-stakes dinner. "The Solstice," Blackwood announced, his voice a low baritone that seemed to absorb the sound. "Acceptable." It was the highest praise anyone could expect. Clara stepped forward. "Good evening, gentlemen. My name is Clara, and I will be your server tonight. May I take your coats?" Blackwood was already taking off his cashmere coat and handed it to her without making eye contact. The other men did the same. The older gentleman looked briefly into her eyes and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. His name, according to the reservation notes, was Anton Petrov, a key figure in a massive Eurasian energy conglomerate. "We'll start with a bottle of Petrus 98, Blackwood, eyeing the wine list, ordered. "And still water for the table. No ice." "Of course, Mr. Blackwood," Clara replied, her voice a professional, calm murmur. As she turned to leave, she caught the beginning of their conversation. Blackwood had switched languages. The change was instant, the hard consonants and fluid vowels of Russian filling the small room. Clara paused, a fraction of a second outside the door, an echo of her old life stirring. She had spent a year on an exchange in St. Petersburg, immersing herself in Dostoevsky and the complex grammar that felt like poetry. She understood every word. Clara continued down the hallway toward the wine cellar, the familiar rhythm of the language resounding in her mind. It was a bittersweet symphony. For 3 years she had repressed that part of herself. The languages she held in her mind, Russian, German, Icelandic, Mandarin, and a functional command of half a dozen more, were like magnificent sleeping birds trapped in a cage of necessity. Here they were useless. Here the only language required was deference. She returned with the wine, presenting it to Blackwood's practiced air of a seasoned sommelier. He gave her a superficial glance and an abrupt nod. She opened the bottle, the pop of the cork, a soft, respectful punctuation mark in their Russian conversation. As she poured the deep, ruby liquid, she couldn't help but listen. They were discussing shipping routes, port access, and the complex geopolitics of a new pipeline. Blackwood then was aggressive, stating his terms with the blunt force of a battering ram. Petrov was more measured, an experienced chess player, countering each move with a calm, unyielding logic. Clara moved around the table, refilling water glasses. She was a ghost again, her mind simultaneously translating their intricate dance of commerce while her body performed the simple, repetitive tasks of her job. It was a strange, unsettling experience. She knew more than Blackwood's two subordinates, who nodded with empty, uncomprehending expressions. She understood the nuances, the veiled threats, the subtle shifts in power. As she placed a breadbasket on the table, Blackwood made an impatient gesture with his hand, nearly knocking it from her grasp. "Water," he said in English, the single word, a brusque, dismissive command. "Of course, sir," she replied, reaching for the water pitcher. She approached his side, her arms steady as she poured. Her proximity discomforted him. He moved slightly, an almost imperceptible flinch from a man who detested the intrusion of service staff into his personal space. And it was then, as she leaned in, focused on the task, that he decided to use her as a conversational accessory. Speaking in Russian, his voice imbued with a biting, casual arrogance, he said, "Look, Anton, this is the problem with this country. No ambition. Look at this girl. Quite pretty, I suppose, but totally empty, destined to spend her life carrying plates for men like us. Tell her to bring more bread, will you? And try not to breathe so loudly while doing it. Simple-minded ones are usually noisy." A cold, silent fury invaded Clara. It wasn't the insult itself. She had endured countless small indignities in this job. It was the cruelty, the assumption of her ignorance, the way he used a language he believed a secret code to dehumanize her to her own face. Blackwood's two associates chuckled softly. Anton Petrov, however, didn't laugh. His gaze passed from Blackwood, he to Clara Vance, a flash of something unreadable in his eyes. Clara finished pouring the water, placed the pitcher on the table with a soft, deliberate click. The sound seemed to hang in the air. For an eternal second she stood perfectly still. The weight of all her past life, of her suppressed intellect, of her burning indignation pressing on her. She could say nothing. She could leave, swallow the bitter bile of his contempt, and bring him his damned bread. That was her job. That was the smart thing. But in that moment, 3 years of her silent mission broke. The caged birds in her mind began to sing a defiant, furious song. She straightened her back, turned her head slightly, and looked not at Sterling Blackwood, but directly at Petrov. And then in perfectly enunciated, formal Russian, her voice calm and clear as a winter morning, she spoke. "My apologies, Mr. Petrov. Mr. Blackwood requests more bread for you. I will bring it immediately and will strive to breathe more silently so my simple mind does not disturb your important negotiations." The effect was instant and profound. The room, which had been filled with the low murmur of high-stakes business, fell into a silence so absolute it felt like a physical pressure. Blackwood's men froze, their subservient smiles wiped from their faces, replaced by jaw-dropped disbelief. They looked at Clara Vance as if she had just sprouted a second head. Their gazes moved nervously between her and their boss, unsure of the appropriate reaction. Anton Petrov's reaction was more controlled, but no less dramatic. His eyebrows rose toward his forehead, and a slow, genuine smile spread across his broad face. He leaned back in his chair, a low laugh rumbling in his chest. He looked at Clara Vance, not with surprise, but with something akin to delight, as if he had just discovered a rare gem in a pile of gravel. But it was Sterling Blackwood's reaction that Clara watched most closely. For a long second he didn't move. He simply stared, fork halfway to his mouth. Wheels spun behind his cold gray eyes, processing the impossible. First came confusion, then comprehension, followed by a dark, surging tide of fury. An opaque red flush spread from the collar of his pristine white shirt, flooding his neck and cheeks. It was the unmistakable color of pure, unadulterated humiliation. He had been exposed before a critical business partner, before his own employees. His arrogance had been returned like a perfectly polished mirror. He had tried to use his knowledge as a weapon, a tool of exclusion and superiority, and the invisible girl had not only deflected the blow, but had caught the sword and held it to his throat. Clara held his gaze a moment longer. There was no triumph in her eyes, nor arrogance, only a quiet, unshakable dignity. She hadn't screamed or made a scene. She had simply stated the facts of his own rudeness in the language he had chosen. The power of her response lay in its absolute tranquility. Without another word, she made a slight formal nod of her head towards Petrov, turned on her heels, and exited the solstice chamber with her back straight as a rod. The moment the door closed behind her, the silence in the dining room broke. She could hear Petrov's resonant laughter, a genuine sound that contrasted completely with the tense atmosphere of moments before. "Well, Sterling," Petrov exclaimed, his voice echoing clearly through the thick wood. "It seems Everly's staff is more qualified than you assumed. A simple mind, I think not. She has better diction than my own nephew in Moscow." Clara leaned against the cool wall in the service corridor, her heart pounding hard against her ribs. Adrenaline rushed through her veins, a volatile cocktail of fear and exhilarating vindication. Her hands trembled slightly. What had she done? She had just committed professional suicide. You didn't embarrass a man like Sterling Blackwood and expect to keep your job. The best she could hope for was to be fired on the spot. The worst, well, a man with his resources could make her life difficult in ways she didn't want to imagine. Her manager, a perpetually stressed man named Jeffrey, came rushing down the hallway. "Clara, what's going on in there? Is everything all right?" Mr. Blackwood's assistant just called reception asking who the server for the solstice chamber is. Clara took a deep breath, steadying herself. "There was a linguistic misunderstanding, Jeffrey." "Linguistic?" he asked, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Mr. Blackwood made a comment in Russian. He assumed I wouldn't understand it," I replied. Jeffrey's face paled. "You spoke to him in Russian?" He looked at her as if she had confessed to setting the curtains on fire. "Clara, you know the rules. No unnecessary conversation with clients, especially not with him. What did you say?" "I merely translated his request for more bread, Jeffrey," she said, the understatement hanging in the air. Before Jeffrey could fully process the impending disaster, the door to the solstice chamber opened. It wasn't one of the subordinates. It was Sterling Blackwood himself. He stood in the doorway, his face a mask of fury. He completely ignored Jeffrey, his piercing gaze fixed on Clara. "You," his voice a low, dangerous growl. "My office tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. He pulled a sleek black business card from his jacket and handed it to her. "Don't be late." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned and went back into the room, closing the door with a force that rattled the wine glasses on a nearby service cart. Jeffrey stared at the closed door, then at Clara, then at the card in her hand. His office, Blackwood Capital. "Clara, what in the world did you do?" Clara looked at the card. The embossed silver letters seemed to glow under the dim hallway light. Sterling Blackwood, CEO, Blackwood Capital, an address in Midtown New York City's shining monument to modern wealth and power. She hadn't been fired yet. She hadn't been summoned. A shiver of apprehension mixed with a strange, defiant curiosity ran through her. The game had just changed. Sterling Blackwood wasn't content with just firing her. He wanted to confront her on his own turf, where the power dynamic was firmly in his favor. She met Jeffrey's panicked gaze. "I think," her voice regaining composure, "I have a meeting to prepare for." Inside the solstice chamber, the atmosphere had changed irrevocably. The business talk had ceased. Blackwood stewed, his jaw clenched. His two assistants avoided his gaze, studying their water glasses, as if they held the secrets of the universe. It was Anton Petrov who finally spoke, with a twinkle of amusement still in his eyes. "You should hire that girl, Sterling," he said, swirling the Petrus in his glass. "Anyone who can handle you with such grace and a tongue sharp as a dagger is worth their weight in gold." She not only understood the language, she understood the nuance, the power of it. That's a rare skill. Blackwood finally looked up, his eyes like flint shards. "Don't be absurd, Anton. She's a waitress." "She is," Petrov countered, taking a slow sip of wine. "Or is it just the uniform? I saw a strategist. You tried to put her in her place, and she put you in yours without raising her voice or breaking protocol. That wasn't an outburst, it was a countermove, a brilliant one." Now, speaking of those port tariffs, Petrov gently steered the conversation back to business, but the point was made. The seed was planted. Sterling Blackwood, a man who prided himself on recognizing and acquiring assets, was forced to look at the invisible girl and see something completely different. She was an anomaly, an unexpected variable he couldn't categorize, and Sterling Blackwood didn't tolerate variables, he conquered them. The next morning, New York City was wrapped in a fine, persistent drizzle that blurred the city's edges into a watercolor of gray and silver. Clara stood at the foot of one Vanderbilt, craning her neck to gaze at the colossal spire of glass and steel piercing the low clouds. It was a building that didn't just occupy space, it dominated it, a monument to power and ambition that she was about to confront. Her Everleig's uniform was gone, replaced by the best and only professional attire she owned. A simple, well-cut navy dress, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, elegant bun. It was her armor. The lobby of Blackwood Capitol was a cathedral of minimalist wealth. White marble floors gleamed under recessed lighting, and the only splashes of color were a massive abstract painting that likely cost more than her father's entire failed company, and the vibrant blue of a digital stock ticker flowing silently along one wall. The air was cool, sterile, and smelled faintly of ozone and ambition. "Clara Vance for Mr. Blackwood," she announced to the receptionist, who sat behind a desk that resembled a giant piece of polished obsidian. The receptionist, a woman with unnervingly perfect hair and a synthetic smile, typed on her keyboard. "He's expecting you. 78th floor. Please take the express elevator to your right." The elevator ride was a silent ascent that made her stomach churn. As the cabin shot skyward, the rain-soaked panorama of New York City unfolded beneath her. It felt like leaving the real world behind and ascending into the realm of gods, or in this case, the demigods of finance. The 78th floor was even more opulent than the lobby. It was an open-plan expanse of glass and chrome, with panoramic views that made the city look like a toy model. A stern-looking woman with a headset and a clipboard, Blackwood's executive assistant, intercepted her the moment the elevator doors opened. "Miss Vance, this way." She led her through the hushed office space, past desks where impeccably dressed men and women typed with silent, focused intensity. No one looked up. It was a realm of absolute, disciplined focus. The assistant stopped before a pair of imposing glass doors. "Mr. Blackwood will see you now." Clara took a deep breath and opened the door. Sterling Blackwood's office was less a workspace and more a command center. It occupied the corner of the building with 2 entire walls of floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a breathtaking 180-degree view of the city. The desk was a slab of polished black granite, utterly devoid of clutter save for a sleek monitor and a minimalist phone. Blackwood was behind it. He stood by the window, his back to her, gazing out at the city he had in many ways conquered. "Miss Vance," he said without turning, his voice calm, controlled, a marked contrast to the barely contained fury of the night before. "Punctual, I appreciate that. Punctuality is the courtesy of kings, and a necessity for everyone else." He turned slowly. He was dressed in a pristine gray suit, the image of corporate power. His face was an unreadable mask. "Please, have a seat," he said, gesturing to one of 2 severe leather chairs in front of his desk. They were clearly designed to be uncomfortable, to put visitors at a distinct psychological disadvantage. Clara sat with her back straight, hands clasped calmly in her lap. She would not be intimidated. Blackwood circled his desk and sat opposite her, leaning slightly forward, his hands clasped on the granite surface. He studied her for a long, silent moment, his gray eyes analytical, as if he were trying to solve a complex equation. "Last night," his voice dropping to a lower register, "you took a considerable risk." "I responded to a direct comment, Mr. Blackwood," Clara countered, her tone even. "It seemed polite." A flicker of something, annoyance, respect, crossed his face. "Polite. An interesting choice of word. Most people in your position would have chosen foolhardy or insubordinate. Most people in my position are not former PhD candidates in linguistics at Yale, specializing in contractual and diplomatic syntax." The words spilled from her lips before she had consciously decided to say them. The moment they were out, she knew there was no turning back. She had laid her cards on the table. Blackwood leaned back, one eyebrow raised. The mask had broken. "Yale," he repeated slowly. "So the question isn't how she speaks Russian. The question is why a Yale PhD candidate is serving wine at Everleigh's." "Life isn't always a linear progression, Mr. Blackwood," Clara said, her voice tight. "My father fell ill. His business failed. I left my program to care for him and pay off the debts. Everleigh's offered a steady paycheck and demanded very little in terms of intellectual investment. It was a practical choice. He nodded slowly, processing the information. The narrative was starting to make sense to him. He was a man who understood systems, and Clara had been a disruptive element because she didn't fit the system he'd placed her in. Now he could see the outlines of a new one. "I understand," he said. "So, your performance last night wasn't just an act of defiance. It was a demonstration of a wasted asset." "I was demonstrating nothing, sir. I was defending my dignity." "Dignity is a luxury," he countered, his voice sharp again. "Assets are a reality. You have an asset, and you're currently being wasted serving overpriced sea bass to hedge fund managers." He paused, his gaze intensifying. "The deal with Anton Petrov is worth $900 million to my firm. It depends on navigating a labyrinth of international regulations, trilingual contracts, and the cultural sensitivities of our partners. Petrov was impressed by you. He found your countermove, as he called it, a mark of character and skill." Clara remained silent, her expression neutral. She was beginning to see where this was going. "I'm a pragmatist, Miss Vance," Blackwood continued. "I don't care about your dignity, your past, or your feelings. I care about results. Last night, by humiliating me, you inadvertently strengthened my position. You showed my partner that my organization, even at the seemingly most insignificant level, possesses unexpected depth. A stupid man would fire you. A smart man would find a way to use you." He leaned forward again, his eyes locked on hers. The predator was back. "I'm offering you a position, a 6-month probationary contract, as a linguistic consultant for the Petrov deal. You'll review documents, attend meetings, and provide real-time analysis and negotiations. You'll report directly to me." He named a salary that made Clara catch her breath. It was more than she would make in a decade at Everly's. It was enough to pay off her father's last debts and start a new life. It was a golden ladder out of the hole she'd been stuck in for 3 long years. It was also a deal with the devil. She would be working for the man who had casually and cruelly insulted her, a man who represented everything she despised about the world of wealth and power. He wasn't offering her a job out of kindness or respect. He was buying her skill. He was acquiring an asset. She looked out the window at the city spread below, a vast, intricate map of possibilities. For 3 years, her world had been the 20-foot radius around her serving station. He was offering her a view from the top of the world. But at what cost to her soul? "Do you find my offer unsatisfactory?" he asked, misinterpreting her silence as a negotiation tactic. Clara turned her gaze back to him. "The offer is generous, but I have a question." "Ask." "Last night, you insulted me because you believed I was beneath you. You saw the uniform, not the person. If I accept, I will wear a different uniform, a suit instead of an apron. What will you see then, Mr. Blackwood? A colleague or just a more expensive servant?" Sterling Blackwood was nonplussed. No one spoke to him like this. His employees feared him, his rivals respected his power. No one questioned his character to his face. For a moment, she thought he would retract the offer, throw her out of his office. Instead, a slow, cold smile touched his lips. It didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Vance," he said, "I will see an asset I have paid a considerable sum for, and I will expect it to perform." Nothing more, nothing less. The honesty was brutal, but it was honest. He wasn't pretending to be a changed man. He was a shark, and he was telling her plainly that he was a shark. It was up to her if she wanted to swim in his ocean. "One more thing," Clara said, her courage solidifying. "You are wrong about dignity. It is not a luxury. It is the one thing that cannot be bought or sold, and I will not compromise it." Blackwood's smile widened slightly. "We shall see," he said. "Human Resources is on the 75th floor. They'll have your contract ready. I expect you here tomorrow at 8. The audience was over. Clara's first week at Blackwood Capital was a baptism by fire. She was given a sterile, glass-walled office far from Blackwood's, a space that was simultaneously prestigious and isolating. She spent the first few days buried under a mountain of documents, contracts, feasibility studies, geological surveys, and political risk assessments, all relating to the Petrov deal. The core of the project involved securing exclusive shipping rights through certain Arctic passages, an undertaking that required not only the cooperation of Petrov's Russian conglomerate, but also navigating the treacherous legal waters of Icelandic maritime authorities. The documents were a dense thicket of legalese written in English, Russian, and to Clara's surprise, Icelandic. Here was where she began to see the true complexity of the challenge. Icelandic, with its ancient grammar and resistance to foreign words, was a minefield of nuance. A single misplaced case ending or a poorly chosen verb could alter the entire meaning of a clause, shifting millions of dollars of liability from one party to another. Sterling Blackwood was an omnipresent, demanding force. He communicated in short, impersonal emails and summoned her to his office with a sharp buzz of the intercom. He never mentioned the incident at Everly's. To him, it was ancient history, the moment of acquisition. Now she was an asset, and he managed his assets hard. He would quiz her on obscure points of Russian syntax, test her knowledge of Icelandic maritime law, and demand instantaneous translations of complex technical documents. Clara met his demands with a cool, unwavering professionalism. The work was exhilarating. The dormant parts of her brain, the ones that had languished while she calculated tips and memorized wine pairings, roared back to life. She felt alive, sharp, her mind a finely tuned instrument once more. No longer just a waitress, she was a linguist, a strategist, rediscovering the power of her own intellect. The first major test came 10 days after she started. Blackwood had a meeting with the Icelandic contingent, a team of lawyers and negotiators from Reykjavik. The meeting was held in the main boardroom, a cavernous space dominated by a 20-foot black marble table and a panoramic view of New York City. Clara was seated, not at the main table, but in a slightly separate chair next to Blackwood's two assistants from that first night, the ones who had chuckled at his joke. Their names were Richard and Thomas, and they now treated her with a mixture of fear and baffled respect. Her role was clear. She was to be a silent observer, a living translation machine for Blackwood to deploy as needed. The Icelanders were led by a man named Gunnar Gunnarsson, a formidable figure with a thick white beard and eyes the color of a stormy North Atlantic Sea. He and his team were courteous but unyielding. The negotiations, conducted primarily in English, quickly hit a snag on a key clause regarding liability in the event of an environmental incident. "Mr. Blackwood," Gunnarsson said, "the language in Clause 17b is unacceptable. Best efforts is too vague. We require a commitment to guaranteed remediation regardless of fault." Blackwood countered, his voice smooth and reasonable, but with an undertone of steel. "Mr. Gunnarsson, a guaranteed remediation clause creates an unacceptable level of open financial exposure. Best efforts is standard language in agreements of this nature." For an hour they went back and forth, the lawyers on both sides dissecting every word. Clara listened with absolute focus. She wasn't just listening to the English, she observed their body language, the way they conferred with each other in quick, whispered Icelandic. Then Gunnarsson changed tactics. He turned to his lead lawyer and in his native tongue began a rapid discussion. He clearly assumed no one on Blackwood's side would understand. "He's a shark," Gunnarsson said, subtly gesturing towards Blackwood. "He won't budge on this. Let's offer the alternative phrase from the Yararibi proposal, the one that uses appropriate measures. It sounds stronger than best efforts, but the legal precedent is on our side. It gives us a loophole if a third party is at fault." His lawyer nodded. "A good strategy. He'll see it as a concession, but we maintain the upper hand. The ambiguity of Bit Gandy is our shield." Clara felt a jolt. Appropriate measures. The literal translation was appropriate measures. To an English speaker, it sounded like a reasonable compromise, perhaps even stronger than best efforts. But she knew, from her deep dive into Icelandic legal precedents, that Gunnarsson was right. The term was notoriously slippery. In a court case 2 years prior involving a fishing dispute, the Supreme Court of Iceland had ruled that appropriate was context-dependent and did not imply exhaustive action. It was a beautifully constructed linguistic trap. Gunnarsson turned back to Blackwood, his expression one of magnanimous compromise. "Mr. Blackwood, in the spirit of collaboration, we are willing to offer a concession. We will withdraw our demand for guaranteed remediation. Instead, we propose that the clause states that Blackwood Capital will take all appropriate measures to rectify any environmental damage." Blackwood's lawyers exchanged relieved glances. One of them leaned in and whispered to Blackwood, "That's a significant concession. Appropriate measures is much stronger ground for us than best efforts. I'd advise we accept." Blackwood looked at the Icelanders with a triumphant glint in his eyes. He was about to accept. He opened his mouth to speak. It was in that split second that Clara knew she had to intervene. It was a huge risk. She was the silent observer, the human dictionary. To speak up, to interrupt her boss in the middle of a critical negotiation, was unthinkable. It was a direct challenge to his authority. far more egregious than her reply at the restaurant. But she also knew that if she remained silent, the company would fall into a multi-million-dollar trap, all because of the subtle nuances of a single adjective. Her contractual duty was to provide linguistic analysis, and this was the most critical analysis she could offer. She stood up. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to her. Blackwood's two assistants stared at her in horror. Gunnison and his team watched her with absolute confusion. Sterling Blackwood turned his head slowly, his eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. His expression wasn't just angry, it was lethal. The unspoken message was clear. This better be the most important thing you've ever said in your life, Miss Vance. Mr. Blackwood, Clara said, her voice clear and strong, projecting across the vast table. May I speak for a moment? The silence in the boardroom was absolute. It was the charged silence of a high-stakes poker game after an unexpected all-in bet. Gunnison and his team exchanged wary glances. Their carefully constructed trap now exposed to the light. Blackwood's lawyers looked utterly bewildered. Sterling Blackwood's stare was glacial. He didn't speak. He simply gestured with a flick of his wrist, a brusque, imperious command for her to approach. Clara walked the length of the table, her footsteps echoing softly on the marble floor. It felt as if she were walking a tightrope over a canyon. She stopped beside his chair and leaned down, keeping her voice low enough so only he and his immediate legal counsel could hear. Sir, she began, her tone formal and devoid of panic, the term Mr. Gunnison has proposed, appropriate measures, is not a concession, it's a calculated legal maneuver. Blackwood's lawyer, a senior partner named Harrison, scoffed quietly. With all due respect, appropriate is a far stronger legal term for us than best efforts. It implies a standard of objective reasonableness. No, it is not, Clara interrupted, her voice firm but respectful. Not in this context, not in an Icelandic court. I reviewed the 2023 ruling in a case between the state of Iceland and a fishing company. The Icelandic Supreme Court set a precedent that the definition of appropriate is highly subjective and conditional to the circumstances. Specifically, it does not create an obligation for exhaustive action. It is weaker than best efforts, because best efforts implies an ongoing, active process. Appropriate measures could be interpreted as a single, minimal action deemed sufficient at that time. She paused, letting the information sink in. They were discussing it in Icelandic. They called it a loophole. They believe you see it as a concession when in fact it transfers most of the long-term liability back to us. Harrison stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. He had been outmaneuvered, not by opposing counsel but by a linguistic nuance he couldn't have been expected to know. Blackwood's expression was unreadable, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. He had been seconds away from falling into the trap. He had been saved from his own victory, and he had been saved by her. The irony was not lost on him. He leaned back in his chair, the picture of calm authority. He had processed the information, analyzed the new strategic landscape, and formulated a counterattack in approximately 5 seconds. 5 seconds. He turned his attention back to Gunnison, who watched him with a carefully neutral expression. Mr. Gunnison, Blackwood said, his voice dangerously smooth. My apologies for the interruption. He nodded briefly in Clara's direction, publicly giving her the title for the first time. My internal consultant just reminded me of that interesting 2023 legal precedent involving the interpretation of a key regulatory term. The color drained from Gunnison's face. His team shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The trap had been sprung, but the jaws clamped shut on air. They were exposed. Blackwood smiled, a cold, predatory showing of teeth. A clever gambit. I appreciate a worthy opponent, however, we will not be accepting your concession. Let's return to the original language of Clause 17b. Or, perhaps, he let the word hang in the air, would you be willing to discuss the freight tariffs in the appendix with a new spirit of flexibility? He had turned their failed gambit into an advantage. He had them on the ropes, and he was pressing his advantage ruthlessly. The entire dynamic of the negotiation had shifted on the blade edge of a single word. Gunnison, a seasoned negotiator, recovered quickly. He let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound of grudging respect. You have an excellent team, Mr. Blackwood. Very thorough. His eyes flickered to Clara with a new understanding in their gaze. Very thorough indeed. The rest of the negotiation was a foregone conclusion. Blackwood, armed with the knowledge of their deception, systematically dismantled their positions, winning concessions on 3 other key points. By the time the meeting concluded 2 hours later, Blackwood Capital had not only secured the deal, but had done so on terms far more favorable than they had thought possible that morning. As the Icelanders packed their briefcases and left, offering stiff, formal handshakes, Blackwood remained seated at the head of the table. His lawyers and assistants quietly filed out, sensing he wanted the room clear. Soon only he and Clara remained. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't tense, but reflective. Blackwood looked out the window at the city spread below. "In my world, Miss Vance," he said finally, still not looking at her, "information is the only currency that matters. More than money, more than power, because it is the source of both. Today, you provided information that saved this company tens of millions of dollars, possibly more." He turned to face her. The cold, analytical mask was gone. For the first time, she saw something else in his eyes. It wasn't warmth, not exactly. It was a deep, almost surprising flash of respect, the kind one warrior gives another after a battle. "At the restaurant," his voice was low, "I saw a uniform. In my office, I saw an asset. Today, I saw a weapon, and I have it pointed at my enemies. It's a formidable feeling." He stood and walked to the window. "That Yale education wasn't wasted after all. You just needed a different battlefield." He turned back to her. "The probationary period of your contract is over. Effective immediately, you are head of linguistic strategy at Blackwood Capital. Your salary is doubled. You will have a permanent seat at this table for all future international negotiations. My assistant will have the new contract ready for you by the end of the day." Clara stood in stunned silence. Head of linguistic strategy, a title he had just invented for her, a permanent seat at the table. It was more than she could have imagined. She had done more than prove her worth. She had carved out a new place for herself in this ruthless citadel of glass. A position built not on deference, but on undeniable skill. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood," she managed to say. "Don't thank me," he replied, his voice returning to its usual clipped tone. "You earned it. Now I need a complete breakdown of the Mandarin dialects spoken by the Shanghai Port Authority Board. I want it on my desk by morning." The moment of connection was over. He was back to business, but everything had changed. He had given her a title, a salary, a position of power. But more than that, he had finally given her something she hadn't even known she was fighting to obtain. He saw her, not the waitress, not the asset, but Clara Vance. And in his world, that was the ultimate sign of respect. The news of Clara's meteoric rise from consultant to the head of a newly created department sent silent shockwaves through the 78th floor. At Blackwood Capital, promotions were earned through years of brutal hours, fierce internal competition, and unwavering loyalty. Clara had achieved it in less than 2 weeks. She went from being the mysterious woman in the glass office to a figure of intense curiosity and speculation. Her new role was both demanding and liberating. The title of head of linguistic strategy was more than a plaque on her door. It was a mandate. Blackwood started including her in the earliest stages of prospective deals. Before lawyers were summoned, before financial models were built, he would call her into his office. He would point to a map, name a company in Seoul, a government ministry in Ankara, or a tech startup in Cincinnati, and he would ask a single question. What's the linguistic landscape? Where are the pitfalls? Where's the advantage? Clara thrived. She built a small, elite team, recruiting 2 other linguists with similar backgrounds in law and finance. They became Blackwood's secret weapon, analyzing corporate communications, unraveling the nuances of political speeches, and creating detailed linguistic profiles of key negotiation targets. They could predict a company's pain points by the way they used conditional clauses in their press releases, or identify a CEO's hidden insecurities by the metaphors they favored in interviews. It was a fusion of art and science, and it gave Blackwood an unprecedented edge. Her relationship with Sterling Blackwood evolved into a complex professional symbiosis. The hierarchy remained absolute. He was the boss. She was his subordinate, but the dynamic had shifted. He no longer treated her as an asset to be deployed, but as a trusted advisor. Their conversations were sharp, efficient, and focused entirely on work. He would challenge her assumptions, pushing her to find deeper layers of meaning. And she, in turn, was one of the few people in the firm unafraid to tell him he was wrong. "Your interpretation of that Japanese quarterly report is too literal, sir," she told him during one late-night session. The repeated use of the phrase, "looking forward," is not a sign of confidence in this context. It's a classic example of corporate face-saving. They are signaling a poor upcoming quarter without explicitly saying so. We should delay our acquisition offer. Blackwood argued, but she held her ground. walking him through the cultural and linguistic precedents. He finally conceded, grudgingly. 3 weeks later, the Japanese company's stock plummeted after a disastrous earnings call. Blackwood Capital swooped in and acquired them for 30% less than their initial offer. He never explicitly said, "You were right." But the next day, a rare bottle of Japanese whiskey was delivered to her office with a simple, unsigned note that read, "Point accepted." Money, once the sole object of her struggles, became an abstract figure on a bank statement. She paid off her father's last medical debts with a single bank transfer, an act that felt both momentous and yet so silent. She moved from her tiny apartment to a modern one overlooking a quiet New York City square. She bought her father, now in good health and retired, a small cottage by the sea, a dream he had talked about for years. She was rebuilding her family's foundation, not with bricks and mortar, but with verbs and vowels. Yet a part of her remained restless. She had triumphed in a world she once disdained. She worked side by side with a man whose initial cruelty had been the catalyst for her new life. Could she ever truly reconcile those two facts? Was she simply a well-paid cog in a ruthless capitalist machine? A machine run by a man like Blackwood? The answer came from an unexpected source. Anton Petrov returned to New York City 6 months after the initial deal was signed to finalize the second phase of the project. A dinner was arranged, not at Everly's, but at another equally exclusive restaurant. This time, Clara was not serving the table. She was seated at it, directly to Blackwood's right. Petrov greeted her warmly, a genuine smile on his face. "Miss Vance, the strategist, it's a pleasure to see you again. I trust Sterling is treating you well. He's fortunate to have you." "Mr. Petrov," Clara replied, returning his smile. "It's good to see you too. And, yes, the work is very rewarding." Throughout the dinner, Clara was an active participant. She clarified contract points in Russian for Petrov, discussed the political climate in English with Blackwood, and proved herself as adept at tabletop diplomacy as she was at contractual analysis. Later in the evening, while Blackwood was occupied with a phone call, Petrov leaned toward her. "He is a difficult man, Sterling," he said softly, his voice imbued with the wisdom of someone who had known him for years. "He sees the world as a series of problems to be solved, of assets to be acquired. He doesn't understand people well. He understands advantage." He swirled the wine in his glass. "That night, in the restaurant, you didn't just show him your skill. You showed him a different kind of strength. Not of money, but of character. He is a man who only respects strength. You forced him to respect you, and in doing so I believe you changed him a little." Clara glanced across the room at Blackwood, who was on his phone, his usual sharp, authoritative tone. Had she changed him? She doubted it, but perhaps she had opened a door in his mind. She had shown him that value could be found in the most unexpected places, that a person's worth was not defined by their position. As the dinner concluded and they rose to leave, Blackwood helped Clara with her coat. It was a common, simple courtesy, but coming from him, it felt significant. As they stepped out into the cool New York City night, he paused by the valet. "I never asked, Miss Vance," he said, his tone uncharacteristically hesitant. "Your father, you said you left Yale to care for him. Is he well?" The question was so unexpected, so personal, that it caught Clara completely off guard. In all the time they had worked together, he had never once delved into her personal life. "He is well," she said, surprised by the warmth in her own voice. "He's retired, living by the sea. He's happy, thank you for asking." Blackwood merely nodded, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Good," he said simply, turning his attention back to the arriving car, the moment of personal connection vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. But it had happened. It was a tiny crack in the armor, a brief glimpse of the man behind the Titan. Anton Petrov was right, perhaps she hadn't changed him, but she had certainly left a mark. Walking home through the quiet streets of Manhattan, Clara realized her new life wasn't a betrayal of her old self. It was a reclamation of it. She hadn't become part of Blackwood's world so much as she had forced his world to make a space for hers. She wasn't just his head of linguistic strategy. She was the woman who had translated his arrogance into opportunity, and in doing so, had written a new chapter for them both. 1 year to the day of the dinner at Everly's, Clara stood by the window of her corner office. The title on her door now read Global Strategy Partner. Her small team had grown into the nerve center of the firm's international operations, and her relationship with Sterling Blackwood had settled into a rhythm of deep mutual respect. She was no longer just his advisor, she was his equal. That afternoon, a sleek envelope appeared on her desk. Inside were 2 tickets to that evening's performance of the New York Philharmonic, a program of Russian composers. It was such an uncharacteristically thoughtful gesture that she knew immediately who it was from. As she prepared to leave, Sterling appeared at her door, dressed in a tux. "Clara," he said the first time he had ever used her given name, "I trust the tickets are acceptable." "They're wonderful," she replied, a small smile playing on her lips. "Thank you, Sterling." He looked out at the city, bright. "I find," he said, his voice low, "that after a year of deconstructing language for profit, it is refreshing to simply experience it as art." It was the closest he would come to an apology, an acknowledgement of the journey that began with a cruel joke and now culminated in a shared appreciation of art. They walked out of the silent office building together. A year ago, she had been a waitress leaving through a service entrance. Tonight, she was a partner on her way to the symphony. As the soaring notes of Tchaikovsky filled the concert hall, Clara knew that she had finally found a language entirely her own. It was a language of resilience, of intellect, and of a quiet, unshakable dignity that no one, in any language, could diminish again.